Hello folks, this is Professor Watts, and today we are going to talk about issues of unemployment and employment, a lecture I titled Measuring Labor Utilization, because as you'll see shortly, it's about much more than just the unemployment rate. There's several different ways of thinking about unemployment, then there's a few ways of thinking about measuring employment. And so we'll walk through about 6 or 8 different measurements that are useful for us in thinking about really how the labor market section of the economy is functioning. So let's dive in with some important definitions to start with. One, what does it mean to be unemployed? It's adults who are willing and able to work, so people who want to work but cannot find a job. Now, notice very importantly here right off the bat, this is not people who are out of work, okay? Because there are several reasons to be out of work and not all of them involve unemployment. You have to be looking for work and not able to get it, okay? Now, why could you be out of work? Well, think about it. I can list at least 3 reasons for not having a job, and 2 of them I'll suggest are probably good. One is that you're retired. Okay, I've built up enough wealth and I don't need to work anymore. I can maybe enjoy a life of leisure or different activities that don't pay me money. A lot of people aspire to this. That's possibly a very good thing. And as our society ages and as we get wealthier, there are many people in this status. So they are without a job but not unemployed because they're not looking for work. Then we've got a lot of people who might not be in retirement age, but nonetheless they don't want or need a job. We have a lot of stay-at-home parents, or just a lot of people who are maybe supported by someone else and they're pursuing other things that might be very important things. They just aren't on some company's payroll. So they're not unemployed unless they're looking for work. Now, the final thing here is that you can't get a job and you want one. Okay, then you are unemployed, right? You are out of work and looking for a job, wanting a job. So that is a very important distinction that you need to be aware of right off the bat here. And that, I guarantee you, will be on our quiz for my macro students. You'll have several situations about a person who's out of work, and you'll have to determine if that person's unemployed or not. Okay, now that we have the concept of unemployment nailed down, now we can talk about the unemployment rate. And this is where we'll start, although as I mentioned, we have several different concepts that we'll look at here involving labor utilization, unemployment, and employment. But let's start with the big one, the unemployment rate. And that is defined as the percent of the labor force without a job. And here's what the math looks like. So we take the number of unemployed and divide that by what's called the labor force. Now, the labor force consists of the people who are unemployed plus all people who are employed. Okay, and then that's expressed always as a percentage. So multiply it by 100. Current data, which I'm recording this in March of 2020, so we always are looking back 1 month. The unemployment data is released by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics on the first Friday of every month. So earlier this month we got the February data. And here's what it looked like. We had 5.8 million unemployed persons in the United States. We had 158.8 million employed persons for a total labor force of 164.5 million. And then when we do the ratio there, we see that we have unemployment rate at 3.5%. Now let's take a look at the source of that official unemployment data. This is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And here you can see the main unemployment data release that they provide every month. This is called the Employment Situation Summary. So here's the current data for February 2020, and then we're looking back for the last 2 months, so January, December, and then we're looking back 1 year. So we can kind of size up the trend we're in currently regarding where unemployment's going. So here's the civilian non-institutional population. Now notice that's not the entire population. The entire population right now in the US is about 329 million. We're only looking at a subset of 259 million. And that's because we're excluding children under the age of 16 and people who are institutionalized. So they might be in prison. Also, it's only the civilian population. Military is kind of treated separately because they're not available to do civilian jobs. Okay, and then of that group, there's the labor force, which remember is those who are working or looking for work. And then we can derive from that the idea of labor force participation, which we'll talk more about here in just a few minutes, and the number of employed, the number of unemployed, the unemployment rate. the number not in the labor force. Okay, and we can see how that's trending. Over time, the unemployment rate's been pretty low, pretty stable, 3.5, 3.6, 3.5 for the past few months, down a little bit from a year ago. And as we'll discuss here momentarily, we are at pretty much all-time lows with overall unemployment. They break this down among many different demographic divisions as well: age, sex, race, education level, etc. So there's lots of data here if you want to do further analysis of the unemployment situation. Okay, now before we move on and talk about refinements of the unemployment concept, we'll briefly discuss why unemployment is problematic. And we'll start at the individual level. Now, first off, we'll address that it's not necessarily a problem if it's just short term. People are looking for jobs and they're going to spend some time finding the jobs that are best for them. And that's really ideal. You don't want to just take the first job that crops up, because it might not be the right job for you. It might not match your skill set. It might not be the job you want the most. So short-term unemployment is generally not viewed as problematic. It's viewed as part of a normal matching process, matching the right workers to the right jobs. Long-term unemployment is where it gets troublesome for obvious reasons. You get into financial hardship due to loss of income. You get into maybe some psychological stress because you're without a job. Maybe you don't have a lot of purpose or motivation in life. And then there's the risk of becoming unemployable or lapsing into chronic long-term unemployment, because prospective businesses might wonder why you've been unemployed for so long. So that can be a severe problem for a very small subset of the unemployed. Then for the economy, unemployment's problematic because if we have high unemployment, we have a lot of people who want to be working and contributing to output, and they're not. So GDP could be below potential. And if unemployment is persistently high, that's a sign that something's wrong with your labor market. The labor market institutions are maybe doing a poor job of matching available workers to available job openings, and that could be a sign of kind of an unhealthy economy. And just to give you a quick example of that, we have unemployment at 3.5% in the US. Now that's very low. Most of that is short term, what we call frictional unemployment. Not a problem. But if you look at a country like Greece, and I don't mean to pick on them, I just be aware that they are a country with chronically high unemployment. They're currently at 18%, and they've barely been below 10% here over the past 30 years. So they have what we might call a chronically high unemployment rate, and that's an indication of maybe some dysfunction in their economy. You can see Germany here was at a similar high level, but they were able to get their unemployment down. They're now in the threes, just like we are in the US, but here's Greece stuck up here in the high teens. They've been as high as 27% within the past 10 years. So that is a symptom of possibly some problems in their broader economy. Now here's a kind of a recap of the US unemployment rate going back basically to the post-World War II time frame, late 1940s. And as you can see, we have our highs and lows. So we spike during a recession, and then we go down. We spike, we go down. We have a very cyclical unemployment rate and a pretty low average. If you kind of visually draw a line through the middle of this data, you'll see it's in the 5 to 6% range. So low average, highly cyclical, characterizes the US. Expect to see unemployment spike again when we enter the next recession. It's only a question of when and how bad it will be. Okay, now we want to move on and talk about the unemployment rates. Little known fact that there is more than one unemployment rate. There's in fact 6 different unemployment rates. And when we talk about the unemployment rate, we're actually just talking about unemployment 3, U3, total unemployed as a percent of the civilian labor force. So that's what we've been looking at, and you can see I'm highlighting that data. Here we are at 3.5% for February. Now, there are 2 unemployment rates that are kind of narrower, more focused concepts of unemployment. So U1, as you can see here, and again I'm at the BLS website, persons unemployed 15 weeks or longer. So remember I had said that unemployment's not a problem if it's short term. So this one kind of factors out short-term people and only focuses on long-term people, and that is only 1.2% of the labor force. So there's a very small segment of the labor force that's in a long-term unemployment situation, and that's the trouble unemployment. And that's unfortunate that that's 1.2% of the labor force, but that's a very small amount of people overall. Okay, then we have U2, which focuses on job losers and persons who completed temporary jobs. So that's kind of a way of gauging people leaving employment involuntarily. That's at 1.7% of the labor force currently. Again, fairly low. Okay, U3, which we've discussed. And then as we go up to U4, 5, and 6, now we're talking about broader unemployment concepts. So U4 includes the unemployed plus are known as discouraged workers as a percent of the labor force. Now, what are discouraged workers? Well, look down here to this note. It says discouraged workers, a subset of the marginally attached, have given a job market related reason for not currently looking for work. Okay, so these are people who ultimately do want a job, but they're not actively looking because there's some problem with their industry or their occupation, their training. Could be geographical, they're unable to get a job where they live, they've given up. So basically, discouraged workers are people who do want to work, but they've given up looking. So they're not included in official unemployment, because remember, those are people who are looking for a job. But when the concept is broadened a little bit, and the Labor Department knows this because they survey tens of thousands of people every month to collect this data. And so they'll ask them, are you working or not? And if people say no, the survey says, well, do you want to be working? And if they say yes, then they ask them, are you looking for a job? If they say no, then they're classified as discouraged workers. If they say yes, I am looking for a job, then they're classified as unemployed. So this kind of gets, this might seem like some hair-splitting differences. It gets pretty detailed and nuanced, but it's useful. We get a very broad set of data that helps us to size up what's going on out there. Okay, so we've got U4 including discouraged workers, and then U5 adds discouraged workers plus all other persons marginally attached to the labor force. Now, what does that mean? Persons marginally attached to the labor force are those who are currently neither working nor looking for work, but indicate that they want and are available for a job and have looked for work sometime in the past 12 months. So the discouraged workers are part of the marginally attached. So you can think of the marginally attached are kind of a broader group of people who have given up looking for. Okay, so naturally when we add in discouraged workers and then the marginally attached, we're going to see the unemployment rate ticks up. Now, only a little bit, which is pretty good news because there's a very small group of discouraged workers. The unemployment rate only goes from 3.5 to 3.8. Not that big of an increase. If we add all the marginally attached, it just does go up to 4.4%. And then finally we have U6, which is the total unemployed plus all the marginally attached, so what we were capturing in U5, plus the total employed part-time for economic reasons, PTER. Now, what is PTER? Let's look down here at the note again. Persons employed part-time for economic reasons are those who want and are available for full-time work, but have had to settle for a part-time schedule. Okay, so think about people who are working part-time. Some of them want to be part-time because they have other obligations in their life. They don't have the time to commit to full-time work. Maybe they don't need a lot of income. In fact, there might be some people working part-time who really don't need the income. They might be on a pension or Social Security, but maybe they want to be out of the house and do something with their time, so they go get a job, right? Those people we don't worry about. The people we might worry about are people who wanted full-time work, but they basically had to settle for part-time work because that was all they could get. That is what PTER means. Okay, so when we add them in as well as the marginally attached, we're going to see a pretty substantial increase in the unemployment rate. Now we're going from 3.5 to 7%. And some commentators will call this U6 the real unemployment rate. I think a good term for it is the underemployment rate. So it kind of captures the people who are officially unemployed plus people who are essentially unemployed but don't count as officially unemployed, plus people who are underemployed. So that's the broadest possible unemployment concept you could look at, U6. All right, so we've got U1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, now let's look at some arithmetic of unemployment. And I want to work through this math. It's pretty simple math to demonstrate to you the importance of thinking about the unemployment situation in a broad context using more than one unemployment rate. So here's my data for Macroville, small economy, where there's these are all in, let's say, millions or thousands, doesn't really matter, but we've got 90 employed, 10 unemployed, which would mean a labor force of 100, right? Because the labor force is the total of the employed and the unemployed. So 90 plus 10, 100 in the labor force. And then we're going to have a certain number of discouraged workers, 2, marginally attached, 4, and remember the 2 are included in this 4 because they're a subset of the marginally attached, and then some part-time for economic reasons, PTER, 5. Okay, so we can calculate the unemployment rates, and I'm just looking at the main unemployment rate, U3, and then the broader ones, 4, 5, and 6. So U3 is just the unemployed, that's the 10 million, divided by the labor force, 100, so that's 10%, of course. U4, we add the 2 discouraged workers to both the numerator and denominator, so now we've got 12 over 102. Work that out on your calculator, or as we'll be doing in homework 3, you'll do that in Excel. So we got 11.7% for the U4 rate. Add in the marginally attached, and notice how this is all color coordinated so you can follow along. U5, we've got, add the 4 marginally attached, we've got 14, and add them to the labor force as well, so we've got 104. 13.5%, and then finally the U6. Now we're adding the marginally attached and the PTER people to the denominator, so they are the unemployed, but the labor force stays at 104, just adding the MAs. Why? Because PTER people are technically working, so they are in the labor force. They're just underemployed. So that's 104. So we got an unemployment rate now of 18.3. Broader unemployment rate, of course, is going to be higher than the narrow unemployment rate. Okay, now I want to give you some scenarios where the unemployment rate changes and we want to size them up. So here we have the unemployment rate going from 10 to 8.2. And we want to ask ourselves, is this good? Is this positive? Well, if you just looked at that raw number, you're going to be tempted to say, yeah, unemployment went down almost 2 percentage points. That's good news for the economy. But is it really? Well, let's look at the data first and say, what's happening here? There's 2 reasons for unemployment to go down. One is that unemployed people got jobs. The other one is that unemployed people gave up in looking for jobs. Okay, which one happened here? Well, look, the employed stays at 90, while the unemployed goes from 10 to 8. So where did those 2 million unemployed people go? They did not go into jobs because employed doesn't go up. So what's happening? Well, as you can see, DW and MA are going up by 2. So what happened is we had 2 million unemployed people give up on looking for jobs, and hence the discouraged workers went up by 2 million. All right, so that causes the unemployment rate to go down, but because we're still including discouraged workers in the broader rates, notice that that does not cause U4, 5, or 6 to go down. They are all the same as they were in the original situation. So this is a decline in the unemployment rate that's not reflecting an improvement in the labor market necessarily. So you want to gauge that U3 rate against all the other rates when you're sizing up this situation. All right, now here's another alternate scenario where unemployment goes down to 8%. So that's a 2 percentage point decline. That looks pretty good. Let's size it up though and make sure we know what's happening, what's driving that. Okay, so in this case, the unemployed has gone from 10 to 8. Where have those 2 million unemployed people gone? Well, we can see here employed has gone up to 92. So they have indeed gotten jobs. DWMA have stayed the same as they were initially. PTER is the same. So what is going to happen to the broader rates here, U4, 5, and 6? Well, you can see that they've all gone down as well, roughly by the same amount, roughly two points each. Right? So you want to look at all the rates together to assess the change in the main rate. Now, with that in mind, let's look at the current data. All right, so we see that the U3 rate from January to February ticked down slightly from 3.6 to 3.5. U4 stayed the same. U5 stayed the same. U6 ticked up ever so slightly from 6.9 to 7.0. Okay, so that's a little bit of a mixed picture. It's generally the case, in fact almost always, that if U3 is going down, U4, 5 are going to go down as well. But in this case, U4 and 5 stayed steady. So that's not necessarily an improvement for discouraged workers. And U6 usually goes down as well. And you can see U6 is down considerably from a year ago. So the general trend is holding up. But U6 did tick up a little bit, which indicates that there might be a slight increase in part-time for economic reasons. So there might be a slight increase of people who want full-time jobs but had to settle for part-time jobs. right, so that's how we parse the unemployment data. Okay, now we want to look at a few other labor utilization measures to round out our discussion of labor metrics. So the first one will be labor force participation. This is pretty simple. We actually saw this already earlier. The percent of the adult non-institutional population who are basically in the labor force, which means they're working or looking for work. So you take the employed plus the unemployed, you divide that by the adult non-institutional population, and here's what we currently have. We have 164.5 million in the labor force. We have an adult non-institutional population, 259.6 million. Okay, and that works out to 63.4% labor force participation rate. Now, is that number good or bad? Or do we not know enough information? Well, we don't know enough information. So we want to look at the trend of that over time and say, where's it going, up or down? And as you can see here, I'm going back to about 1990 or so in this chart for labor force participation. Well, you can see it's down quite a bit from where it was in the late 90s, where it peaked at an all-time high of over 67%. And then it drifted down a little bit. There was a recession here in 2001. And it stayed pretty stable in the mid-2000s at about 66. And then here's the recession that hit us in 08, 09, and it started to fall after that. And then it just kept falling, and bottomed out at about 62, 63%. Okay, and then it's maybe started to come up a little bit in the last couple of years, but it's hard to see a strong trend there. So is this bad news for the economy because we've got a significant decline here? We've got about a 3 or 4 point decline in labor force participation. Well, you have to think about what could be driving changes in labor participation. And a big one of them, remember, we discussed at the beginning, is retirement. People retire, they're no longer in the labor force. And if there's a big move of people from the labor force to retirement, that could be driving a big change in participation rates. So the way we filter that out is by looking at what we call the prime age participation rate, 25 to 54-year-olds. So we've excluded people on the upper end of the age spectrum who might be retired, and also people on the lower end of the age spectrum. Now, why might they not be in the labor force? Many of you right now might be in this situation. You're pursuing education full-time, and you're not able to do full-time work, or at least not consistently. So we actually will carve out both of those situations and look at only prime age workers, and we see a much different story here. Yes, there was some slight downtrend in this here in the recession and following, but then that bottomed out and then it started rising again. And we are actually here currently at about 83%, and the all-time high is just shy of 85%. So it's not like we're drastically below our all-time high there. So not necessarily bad news at all if you look at this in an appropriate manner, kind of slice out some confounding aspects. Right, and you can see now I've got labor force participation here going back again to about post-World War II period, 1940s, and you can see that it was actually quite a bit lower than today, back in the 1950s and 60s. Then in the mid-60s it started to rise pretty steadily. Okay, so we're about 60% back then, and then it rose all the way to 67%, then it came down. So this is driven by some demographic factors, mostly women entering the labor force in much larger numbers starting in the 1960s, and then the declines lately have been largely from baby boomer retirements. Okay, finally, let's look at the employment to population ratio, which, as the name implies, it's just the number of employed divided by the population. That's pretty easy to size up. Current data, we've got 158.8 million working. We've got 259.6 million non-institutional adult population for an employment population ratio of 61.1%. All right, now again, good, bad, indifferent. Well, we don't know. We want to compare that to a trend. So let's look at the data here. And as we can see, this will rise and fall with periods of economic boom and recession. So you can see the gray bars here. Every time we have a recession, 91, 2001, 2008, 2009, this will fall, usually recover afterwards. Now it fell here hard during the 2008-9 recession, down about 58%. We've climbed back up again, now we're at 61%. So I'm not necessarily concerned about the absolute level of this because, again, we have a lot of retirees lately. I'm concerned about the trend. The trend is strongly positive since about 2011, 2012. Okay, so now we hopefully have a pretty good understanding of how we measure both unemployment and employment concepts, so we can look at the data and kind of assess the health of our labor market and whether we're in recession or not. Next lecture, we will take a look at some causes of unemployment and try to understand what's driving unemployment and how we should think about unemployment. Is public policy needed to correct it, or is it part of a natural and functioning market economy? Stay tuned.